Welcome back. In this lecture, we're going to discuss how multiplayer works within Unreal Engine 5 and hopefully give you a better understanding about how we've designed this survival game in a way that everything is multiplayer replicated. Alright, so the very first thing that you need to understand about multiplayer is that there is a certain set of rules that you need to follow when programming or creating a multiplayer game within Unreal Engine. The unfortunate thing is that you can't just wave a magical wand and have everything magically work within multiplayer. And if you guys have watched a tutorial before online and maybe tried testing whatever you created in multiplayer, you've probably run into the same sort of issues where things aren't replicating properly, you can't see other clients, or whatever the problems may be. And that is because, again, there is a certain set of rules that you need to follow when making multiplayer work within Unreal Engine, and once you understand those principles, you'll be able to pretty much make any sort of multiplayer game that you want. Now, the first thing I want to discuss in this lecture is how to actually test out multiplayer within Unreal Engine, within the editor, as well as the two different types of game servers that Unreal Engine has. So, the very first thing is in our project here, if you remember from our previous lecture, you hit these three drop-down buttons, and down here under the multiplayer options, we have the number of players. Usually when I'm testing things out, I usually have 2 players. Of course, you can increase this to 4, but unless you have a powerful computer, it takes a lot of performance. Now, under the net mode here, you're going to see that we have 3 different options. So we have standalone, listen server, and client. So standalone is essentially like single player. So if you're making a single player game, by default, this is going to be enabled. So whenever you're making like a new project in Unreal Engine, this is the default settings. You're gonna have 1 player, and it's gonna be single player. Okay, so if you want to test it out as multiplayer, you're gonna set this to 2 players, and you're gonna change this to either a listen server or a client. Now, the difference between these two is basically you need to understand that there's 2 different types of game servers. You have a listen server and then a dedicated server. So this is the listen server, and then this is the dedicated server. So the listen server is essentially when a client goes and clicks like a host button. So games like Minecraft, Call of Duty, games where you can host your own game from inside like your options menu, that's basically a listen server. So it's sort of a peer-to-peer server. Now, the benefit of listen servers are that, you as the game developer, you don't have to pay money to host servers yourself. You can just have the players host their own servers, and you don't have to worry about, paying for server hosting. The downside is that it's limited to however many players you can have per session. So you really can't have, I think, more than probably 20 players. I know there's a max limit for listen servers. Another downside is, obviously if the person who is hosting the listen server, they exit out the game, the entire server goes down and everyone who was on it, gets disconnected. So, you might want to have a game with listen servers, with that peer-to-peer hosting if you are making, a simple game and you don't really want to pay to host your own servers, or you can have a dedicated server. So the dedicated server is sort of like a terminal, like CMD. So basically it will run sort of like a terminal process, and the only thing that the dedicated server is doing is processing data, like the positions of the client, and it's doing no visual things, right? It's not rendering an actual game client like the listen server is. So the reason why you'd want a dedicated server is, if you want the maximum amount of players, like 70 to 100, the way, Fortnite, Ark, many, different popular games, the way they have their servers designed is they have dedicated servers that are hosting a specific map or specific game mode or whatever. Now, technically you can have both in your game. You can either have a listen server or a dedicated server, but throughout this course we're just going to be using and setting up this entire game for a dedicated server. And I'm going to show you at the end of this course how you can get the dedicated server executable and how you can distribute it to your players, also host it on your own computer if you wanted to, how to open the ports, and also how to host it on external hosting platforms like Amazon Web Services and what the pricing looks like for that. So those are the two different servers. You have your listen server and your dedicated server. And if we hit these three drop down buttons, throughout this entire course, we're going to be testing our netmode as clients. So this is the dedicated server option right here. And so if we hit play, it's going to have two editor windows here. So we're going to have client 1 and client 2. And in fact, if I close this, hit this drop down and do play in new editor window, what this will do is it will open up two different windows right here. Okay, and so at the very top you can see we have client number 1 and then client number 2. Right, so we can run around and you can see that our character right now, everything is replicated up until this point. And I think if we were to pick up this gun, okay, so that is replicated, but everything thus far, all the logic that we're going to program needs to basically be set up in a way that it will either 1, replicate so that other players can see what's going on, or 2, the logic or code needs to be executed on the server. Now this is very important because you want to do all your checks on the server. For example, if you have things like health, if you're modifying things like health, like say my player has a weapon and shoots the other player and it applies damage, all of that logic needs to be executed on the server instead of being executed on the client. Because if you have all that stuff executed and stored on the client, then whoever's playing, they can write some sort of cheat client or whatever. They can try to hack your game and input whatever values into your game and say they have 1,000 HP or infinite HP, or even they could spawn in certain items that they want. So we're going to avoid all of that by doing everything the proper way, which is making sure that everything is stored and executed on the server. And I will explain this and show you this in practice. And so you'll get a lot of real-world application throughout this course. So you don't have to worry about, understanding all the things that I'm explaining right now. I'm just kind of giving you a basic overview of what to expect when you're working with multiplayer within Unreal Engine 5. Now that's pretty much the basics that you need to know about right now. Again, we'll be using this play 2 players and as client throughout this entire course. That will be the dedicated server setup. Sometimes we'll use a standalone. That's only if you're going to be testing out like the main menu. But yeah, that's pretty much the setup for our multiplayer going forward. And that's it for this lecture. In our next lecture, I'm going to be discussing the Unreal Engine framework, fundamentals, the different actors, inheritance, and this is going to be a really good primer for you leading up to when we design our inventory system. That way you understand why it's designed the way it is, as well as all the other different gameplay systems that we create throughout this course. So with that being said, I'll see you guys in the next lecture.